Hello everyone. Welcome to Learn English Now. Today we are going to talk about one of the biggest wars in the 20th century, the war between Japan and China. This war started in the 1930s and went on for many years. It was a very hard time for the people of China. Many people died, many homes and cities were destroyed, and the future of Asia was changed. Today, the Chinese government often says they won the war against Japan. Some others believe Japan simply left because of pressure from the Allies, especially the United States. And the Soviet Union? How could a small country like Japan take control of a large part of China's land? That is what we will find out. In this lesson, we will learn how Japan invaded China and why they wanted to do it. We will talk about the fighting that happened, the plans both sides used, the problems China faced, and how the war finally ended. The information in this video is presented in a neutral way and only focuses on the facts. Part 1. The situation before the invasion. To understand how Japan invaded China, we must first look at the situation in both countries. This was in the early 20th century. Before the war started, both countries were very different. Japan was a modern and strong country. In the late 1800s, Japan had a big change called the Meiji Restoration. Japan decided to become a modern nation. They learned from countries in the West like the United States and Great Britain. Japan built many factories. It also built a very powerful military. The Japanese army and navy were well trained. They had modern weapons. They were also very organized. Japan wanted to become a powerful empire. It wanted to expand its control over other countries. Japan's military leaders believed that to be a strong country, they needed to have more land and more resources. They especially needed resources like oil, coal, and iron to run their factories and military. China was in a very different situation in the early 1900s. China was not a strong country. It had a lot of internal problems. China's last empire, the Qing dynasty, had ended. The country was not united. There was a central government, but it was weak. China was divided. The country was controlled by many different regional military leaders. These leaders were called warlords. The warlords often fought with each other. The central government could not control them. The Chinese army was also not very modern. It had many soldiers, but they were often poorly trained. Their weapons were old. The country was in a state of chaos. This situation in China was a big opportunity for Japan. The Japanese leaders saw that China was weak and divided. They thought it would be easy to invade China. They believed they could take the resources they needed from China. They could also expand their empire. They thought they could do this without much resistance. This was a big reason for their decision to invade. They saw a chance to take advantage of China's internal problems. The weakness of China was the first step on the road to war. Japan also felt that it was racially and culturally superior to China. This belief in superiority was another driving force behind their aggression. Part 2. The first steps, the invasion of Manchuria. The first major military action by Japan was not a full invasion of all of China. It was an invasion of a large region called Manchuria. Manchuria is in the northeast part of China. This region had a lot of resources like coal and iron. It was a very important place for Japan. The invasion started with a small event. This event is called the Mukden Incident. It happened on September 18, 1931. The Japanese military had soldiers in Manchuria. They had been there for a long time. There was a railway line in Manchuria. This railway was owned by Japan. On that day, a small part of the railway was damaged by a bomb. The Japanese military claimed that Chinese soldiers had done this, but this was not true. The Japanese military had placed the bomb themselves. They used this small incident as an excuse. They said they needed to protect the railway. Using this excuse, the Japanese army quickly invaded Manchuria. The invasion was very fast. The Chinese army in Manchuria was weak. They were not ready for an attack. The Chinese leader, Chiang Kai-shek, told his army not to fight back. He believed China's army was not strong enough to fight Japan. He hoped that other countries would help China, but no country helped the League of Nations. An international group of countries did not stop Japan. They just talked about the problem. In just a few months, Japan had taken control of all of Manchuria. It was a very big part of China. The Japanese military then created a new country in Manchuria. They called it Manchukuo. But this new country was not real. It was a puppet state. A puppet state is a country that seems to be independent, but it is really controlled by another country. Japan controlled all the government and the military in Manchukuo. They used the new country to get all of Manchuria's resources. The invasion of Manchuria was a big victory for Japan. It was a clear sign of Japan's military power and its plan to expand. This was the first major step in their invasion of China. It showed that other countries were not willing to stop them. Part 3: The Marco Polo Bridge Incident in Full-Scale War. The invasion of Manchuria was only the beginning. Japan's military leaders wanted to control more of China. Tensions between the two countries continued to grow for several years. The event that started the full-scale war happened in 1937. This event is called the Marco Polo Bridge Incident. The Marco Polo Bridge is a famous bridge near Beijing, the capital of China. On the night of July 7, 1937, Japanese and Chinese soldiers were near the bridge. The Japanese army was conducting military drills in the area. A Japanese soldier went missing. The Japanese military claimed that Chinese soldiers had kidnapped their soldier. They demanded to search a nearby Chinese town for him. The Chinese soldiers refused to let them search. A small fight started between the soldiers. The fight was a small incident, but it quickly became a big problem. The Japanese military used the small fight as an excuse to start a full invasion. They sent a lot of soldiers to the area. They attacked Beijing. The Chinese army fought back this time. They did not retreat like they did in Manchuria. The fighting spread very quickly. This incident marked the beginning of the Second Sino-Japanese War. This was a full-scale war between the two countries. Japan's military was very organized and well-equipped. They were able to defeat the Chinese army in many battles. Japan's military had better weapons. They had airplanes, tanks, and modern artillery. The Chinese army had a lot of soldiers, but they had old weapons. They were not as well trained. Japan's army moved very quickly. They captured many important cities in northern China. They captured Beijing. They also moved as they invaded Shanghai. The Battle of Shanghai was a very long and brutal battle. It lasted for many months. The Chinese soldiers fought very hard, but in the end, Japan's military won the battle. Shanghai fell to the Japanese. After the fall of Shanghai, the Japanese army moved toward the city of Nanjing. Nanjing was the capital of China at that time. The capture of Nanjing was a huge defeat for China. The Japanese army entered the city in December 1937. This was a very dark time. The Japanese soldiers committed a lot of terrible acts against the people of Nanjing. This event is known as the Rape of Nanjing. The full-scale war had started. Japan had shown its military power. It was clear that the war would be long and difficult. Part 4: Japan's military strategy and advantages. How was Japan able to invade such a big country? China was much larger than Japan. China had many more soldiers than Japan, but Japan had many advantages. They also had a very effective military strategy. First, Japan had a big advantage in military technology. Their army had modern tanks. Their air force had modern airplanes. These planes could drop bombs on Chinese cities and military positions. The Japanese Navy was also very strong. They used their navy to transport soldiers and supplies to China's coast. The Chinese army did not have many airplanes or tanks. Their soldiers had old rifles. Their artillery was not as powerful. This difference in technology was a huge factor. Japan could attack from the sky and the sea. China could only fight on the land. Second, Japan's army was much better trained and organized. The Japanese soldiers were very disciplined. They followed orders. Their commanders had a clear strategy. They wanted to capture the big cities and the railway lines. This was a very smart strategy. The big cities were the centers of power and economy in China. By controlling the cities, Japan could control the country's trade and industry. The railway lines were important for moving soldiers and supplies. The Japanese army could move very quickly along the railways. Third, Japan's strategy was to fight a war of attrition. They knew they could not defeat the entire Chinese army in one big battle, so they decided to defeat them in many smaller battles. They would conquer one city at a time. They would take control of one part of the country at a time. The Chinese government, led by Chiang Kai-shek, had to move its capital inland. They moved the capital to the city of Chongqing. This was a safe place in the mountains. Japan was also able to use its economic power. Japan's industrial factories were much stronger than China's. They could produce many more weapons, planes and ships. They could produce these things much faster. The Chinese army could not get new weapons quickly. This meant that as the war went on, the Chinese army became weaker. The Japanese army became stronger. The military difference was too big for China to overcome easily. The Japanese army used a lot of force and violence. They were brutal to the Chinese people. This was a part of their strategy to create fear. They wanted the Chinese people to lose hope. They wanted the Chinese government to surrender, but the Chinese people did not give up. They continued to resist. Part 5: China's resistance and challenges. Even with Japan's advantages, China was a huge country. Japan could not conquer all of it. The Chinese people and the military fought back, but they faced many challenges. One of the biggest challenges was political division. China was not a united country. There were two main political groups. One group was the nationalists, led by Chiang Kai-shek. The other group was the communists, led by Mao Zedong. The nationalists and the communists were enemies. They had been fighting a civil war against each other. When Japan invaded, they decided to stop fighting each other. They formed a temporary alliance. This alliance was called the United Front, but they did not trust each other. They still fought each other sometimes. This division made it hard for China to fight a strong, unified war against Japan. Another big challenge for China was its military weakness. China's army was very large. It had millions of soldiers, but they were not well equipped. They did not have many modern weapons. Their airplanes and tanks were old. Many soldiers did not have good training. China's military leaders knew they could not defeat Japan in a direct fight, so they used a different strategy. Their strategy was to trade space for time. This meant they would retreat inland. They would let Japan take control of the coast and the big cities. They hoped to exhaust the Japanese army. They hoped to make the war last a very long time. China also received foreign aid. In the beginning, this aid was not enough. The United States and other countries did not want to get involved in the war. They did not send a lot of help. But over time, some countries started to help China. The Soviet Union sent some airplanes and pilots. The U.S. sent some small amounts of aid. Later, the U.S. sent a group of volunteer pilots called the Flying Tigers to help China. But this help was small in the beginning. China was fighting the war mostly on its own. The Chinese military and the Chinese people used many different methods to fight back. They used guerrilla warfare. This is a type of warfare where small groups of soldiers attack the enemy. They make surprise attacks. They do not fight in big battles. This type of warfare was very effective. The Japanese army could control the cities, but they could not control the countryside. The Chinese guerrillas were always there. They were always fighting. This made it very hard for the Japanese army to control the country. The Chinese people also resisted the Japanese occupation in many ways. They did not cooperate with the Japanese. They secretly helped the Chinese army. The Chinese people's resistance was a big reason why Japan could not win the war easily. Part 6. The war expands and stalls. After the first few years of the war, the situation changed. Japan had conquered a huge part of China. They controlled all the big coastal cities. They controlled the main railway lines. The Chinese government had moved its capital far inland to Chongqing. But Japan could not defeat the Chinese army completely. The Chinese army was still fighting. The war became a stalemate. A stalemate is a situation where neither side can win. The Japanese military tried to move further into China, but they faced many problems. The country was too big. Their supply lines were very long. Their soldiers were spread out over a very large area. This made them vulnerable to attacks from Chinese guerrilla fighters. Japan's army had to fight against the Chinese military. They also had to fight against the Chinese people. At the same time, the war in China started to connect with a bigger global conflict. In 1939, World War II had started in Europe. Japan's ally was Germany. The U.S. was not in the war yet, but the U.S. was starting to help China more. The U.S. government gave money to China. They also gave China military equipment. This aid came from a special route. This route was called the Burma Road. The road went through the country of Burma, which is now Myanmar. The road allowed the U.S. to send supplies to the Chinese government in Chongqing. Japan saw the U.S. as a threat. Japan wanted to stop the U.S. from helping China. Japan also needed more resources, especially oil. The U.S. had stopped selling oil to Japan. Japan looked for a new source of oil in Southeast Asia. But the U.S. had a powerful navy. This navy was a big obstacle. It was a threat to Japan's plans to expand. So Japan made a big decision. They decided to attack the U.S. on December 7, 1941. Japan attacked the U.S. naval base at Pearl Harbor in Hawaii. This attack officially brought the U.S. into World War II. The war in China was now a part of the bigger World War. This was a major turning point. Part 7. The End of the War and Its Legacy. After the attack on Pearl Harbor, the war in China changed. The United States became a full ally of China. The U.S. started to send a lot more aid. They sent more money, more weapons, and more airplanes. This aid came through the Burma Road. The U.S. also started to fight Japan in the Pacific Ocean. This helped China a lot. Japan had to fight a war on two fronts. They had to fight in China. They also had to fight in the Pacific against the U.S. Japan's military could not win a war on two fronts. The war in China continued for many more years. The fighting was very hard. The Chinese army fought bravely. The U.S. and its allies fought against Japan in the Pacific. They slowly pushed the Japanese army back. The U.S. dropped 2 atomic bombs on Japan in August 1945. Japan surrendered. This ended World War II. Many people have a question about the end of the war in China. Did China really defeat Japan? Or did Japan simply leave because they were losing the bigger war against the Allies? The answer is complex. It is not a simple yes or no. China's contribution. The Chinese army fought a long and very difficult war. They tied down a large number of Japanese soldiers for many years. A big part of the Japanese army was in China. These soldiers could not fight against the U.S. or other allies. The Chinese army's resistance was crucial. It kept the Japanese military from being able to focus all its power somewhere else. So China's fighting did play a vital role. It weakened Japan's overall military power. In this way, China did contribute significantly to the victory. Allied pressure. However, the final defeat of Japan was a result of a larger global effort. Japan did not surrender because China alone had defeated them. Japan surrendered after the U.S. dropped 2 atomic bombs. The Soviet Union also joined the war against Japan and invaded Manchuria in August 1945. These 2 major events put a huge amount of pressure on Japan. The Japanese government saw that they could not continue the war. The surrender was a direct result of these final actions from the Allies. So we can say that China did not defeat Japan. It was a victory for the Allies, including China. China's long war of resistance was a key part of the Allied effort. It was a victory that came from many countries fighting together. The war had a huge cost for China. The number of people who died was very large. More than 15 million Chinese people were killed. This number includes soldiers and civilians. The war destroyed many cities and villages. The economy of China was ruined. The war was a very difficult time for the Chinese people. The war also had a big impact on China's future. After Japan surrendered, the civil war in China started again. The nationalists and the communists started fighting each other. The communists, led by Mao Zedong, won the civil war. They took control of the country in 1949. The nationalists moved to the island of Taiwan. Some historians believe that the war with Japan weakened the nationalists. The war in China was a very important part of World War II. It was a long, brutal conflict. It showed the bravery of the Chinese people. It also showed the great cost of war. The war's legacy is still felt in China and across Asia today. It was a major event that shaped the modern world.